February 18, 1945, the Ardennes forest, somewhere between Belgium and Germany. Snow falls in silence, covering the ash and the shrapnel, the burnt trees and the frozen corpses no one has come to claim. Two boys crouch beneath a hollow oak, its trunk split open by mortar fire weeks ago. Their names are Emile and Laurent, 11 and 9 years old, brothers, orphans, alone. Emile's hands shake not from cold, but from the weight of keeping them both alive. Laurent has stopped asking when Mama will come back. He watches the horizon instead, where black smoke curls into grey sky, where distant thunder is not weather but artillery. The air smells of pine sap and burning metal. Emile holds a spoon in his coat pocket, the only thing left from home. His breath comes in small clouds. Laurent's lips are cracked and pale. Neither has eaten in 3 days. And then, through the trees, they hear it. The terrible whine of an engine failing, the scream of metal tearing through air, and the earth-shaking crash of something falling from the sky. If stories like this move you as deeply as they move me, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. These forgotten stories deserve to live again, and your voice helps make that happen. Emile and Laurent were not always hollow-eyed wanderers in a dying forest. 6 months earlier, they lived in a stone farmhouse outside Bastogne with their mother, their grandfather, and a goat named Clarisse. Their father had been gone since 1940, taken by the war before Laurent could remember his face. Their mother baked bread on Sundays and sang old Walloon songs while she worked. Emile wanted to be a schoolteacher. Laurent collected acorns and built tiny villages in the dirt behind the barn. They did not know what liberation meant, or occupation, or offensive. They knew only that soldiers sometimes passed through, that the sky growled at night, and that Mama told them to be quiet when boots came near. Then in December, the Germans returned in force, tanks, trucks, columns of exhausted infantry retreating and regrouping for Hitler's desperate gamble in the Ardennes. The Wehrmacht needed supplies, roads, shelter. The farmhouse stood in the way. On December 19, 1944, the boys watched from the cellar as their mother went upstairs to speak with an officer. They heard voices, a single gunshot. Silence. Their grandfather tried to stop them from going up. He could not. When they climbed the stairs, their mother lay near the door, her apron stained red, her hand still reaching toward the kitchen, as if she had been trying to get them something to eat. The soldiers were already gone. Their grandfather buried her behind the barn while the boys stood in the snow, too numb to cry. 2 days later, their grandfather died in his sleep. His heart, the cold, grief, or all three. The boys buried him beside their mother with a shovel too heavy for their arms. Then they took what little food remained, wrapped themselves in wool blankets, and walked into the forest because there was nowhere else to go. For 2 months, Emile and Laurent survived like ghosts. They learned to move at night, to sleep in abandoned bunkers and burnt-out barns, to avoid roads where patrols might see them. They ate frozen potatoes scavenged from ruined cellars, drank snow melted in their palms, chewed on pine bark when there was nothing else. Emile kept Laurent moving even when the boy's legs buckled, even when fever made him shake and mutter in his sleep. He told Laurent stories to keep him awake, stories about the schoolhouse he would teach in one day, about the bread Mama used to make, about how spring would come and the forest would turn green again. But spring felt impossible. The war had no end, the forest had no mercy, and the boys had no plan except to wake up each morning and survive one more day. Then came February 18th, and the crash. The sound tore through the trees like the hand of God slamming down. Emile grabbed Laurent and pulled him deeper into the hollow of the oak, his heart hammering, his mind screaming that bombs were falling, that they had been found, that this was the end. But there was no explosion. Only the groan of twisted metal, the hiss of steam, and then silence. Minutes passed. Laurent whispered, "What was it?" Emile did not answer. He was listening for engines, for voices, for the sounds of soldiers coming to search the wreckage. But there was nothing, only wind and snow, and the faint crackle of something burning. Against every instinct that told him to stay hidden, Emile stood. "Stay here," he told Laurent. The boy grabbed his coat. "No, we stay together." And so together they walked toward the smoke. The plane had come down in a clearing 1/2 kilometer from their oak tree. It was a fighter, small, single engine, its wings sheared off by treetops, its fuselage crumpled like paper. Fire licked at the tail, but the cockpit was intact. Emile approached slowly, his breath shallow, his eyes scanning for movement. Laurent stayed close behind, clutching the back of Emile's coat. They had seen planes before, high above, silver shapes that left white trails across the sky. But this was different. This was real. This was close. And inside the cockpit, slumped against the controls, was a man. He wore a leather jacket, a helmet, goggles pushed up onto his forehead. His face was pale, streaked with blood from a gash along his temple. His breathing was shallow, labored, and on his shoulder, stitched clear and unmistakable, was the black eagle of the Luftwaffe. Emil froze. Every lesson his mother had whispered, every warning his grandfather had given, all of it screamed at him to run. This was the enemy. This was the uniform of the men who had taken his father, who had shot his mother, who had turned the world into ash and hunger and death. This man was a soldier, a killer, a German, and he was dying. Emil should have walked away. He should have taken Laurent's hand and disappeared back into the forest and let the cold finish what the crash had started. But he did not. Because when Emil looked at the man's face, he did not see a monster. He saw someone's son, someone's brother. He saw a boy, not much older than himself, bleeding and broken and alone. And for reasons Emil could not explain, he stayed. Laurent tugged at his coat. "Emil, we have to go." But Emil was already moving toward the cockpit. The canopy was cracked but not shattered. He climbed onto the wing, his hands shaking, and pulled at the glass until it slid back with a groan. The pilot stirred, his eyes fluttering open, pale blue, unfocused, filled with confusion and pain. He tried to speak, but the words came out garbled, broken. German words Emil did not understand, but he understood the fear in the man's eyes. He understood the way the pilot's hand moved instinctively toward a sidearm that was no longer there, and he understood that this man, enemy or not, was as frightened as he was. "Help me," Emil said to Laurent. The boy stared at him as if he had gone mad. "He's a German. He's dying. He's a German, Emil." Emil looked at his brother, at the hollow cheeks and haunted eyes, at the boy who had buried his mother and learned to fear every shadow, and he said very quietly, "So are we." Laurent did not argue. Together they pulled the pilot from the cockpit. He was heavy, dead weight, his legs useless. They dragged him away from the burning plane and into the cover of the trees, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. The pilot groaned, half conscious, his head lolling against Emil's shoulder. They laid him down beneath a cluster of pines, and Emil tore a strip from his own blanket to wrap around the man's head, pressing it against the wound to slow the bleeding. Laurent watched, silent, his small hands clenched into fists. "What do we do now?" he whispered. Emil did not know. He had no medicine, no food, no shelter. He had a dying enemy soldier, a terrified brother, and a forest full of patrols that would shoot them all if they were found. But he had made a choice, and now he had to see it through. The pilot's name was Friedrich. Emil learned this later, after the fever broke and the man could speak without delirium clouding his words. He was 23 years old, a fighter pilot from Bavaria, shot down during a skirmish with American P-47s over the Ardennes. He had been flying for 2 years since 1943, when the Luftwaffe was already bleeding pilots faster than it could train them. He did not speak of glory or the Führer or victory. He spoke of his sister who played piano in Munich. He spoke of his mother, who made apple strudel every Christmas. He spoke of a war he no longer believed in, and a sky that had become his grave. And he wept once when Emil told him about the farmhouse and the gunshot and the woman in the apron. "I'm sorry," Friedrich said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Emil did not forgive him, but he did not leave him either. For 3 days, the boys kept Friedrich alive. They scavenged what little they could. A half-frozen turnip, a tin of condensed milk from an abandoned supply crate, snow to keep him hydrated. Emil changed the bandage on Friedrich's head, using strips torn from Laurent's blanket when his own ran out. Laurent kept watch, his eyes scanning the forest for movement, his ears tuned to the distant sounds of artillery and engines. They did not speak much. There was nothing to say. They were 3 people who should have been enemies, huddled together in the cold, bound by nothing but the fragile thread of survival. And then, on the 4th day, they heard voices. The patrol came from the west, American voices, rough and loud, calling out commands in English. Emil's heart seized. Friedrich stiffened, his hand instinctively moving to his side where his weapon should have been. Laurent pressed himself against Emil, his breath quick and shallow. The voices grew closer, boots crunching in snow, the metallic click of rifles being readied. They were searching the crash site. They were looking for survivors, and they were going to find them. Emil made a decision. He stood, stepping in front of Friedrich, his arms spread wide. Laurent grabbed at him, panic in his eyes. "What are you doing?" "Saving us," Emil said, and then he shouted, in the broken, hesitant English his grandfather had taught him years ago, "Don't shoot! We are children! Don't shoot!" The patrol stopped. Silence, heavy and suffocating. Then footsteps, fast and deliberate. 3 American soldiers emerged from the trees, rifles raised, eyes hard. They saw the boys first, thin, ragged, trembling. Then they saw Friedrich, lying in the snow, pale and bloodied, wearing the unmistakable uniform of the Luftwaffe. One of the soldiers raised his rifle. "Step away from the German." Emil did not move. "He's hurt." "I said step away." "He didn't hurt us." The soldier's face twisted with something between anger and confusion. "Kid, he's the enemy." Emil met his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, he felt something other than fear. He felt rage. "The war is the enemy," he said, his voice shaking. "He is just a man." The soldier stared at him. Then slowly he lowered his rifle. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. He gestured to the others. "Get the medic." Friedrich was taken as a prisoner of war. The Americans treated his wounds, gave him water, and led him away in handcuffs. Before he left, he looked back at Emile and Laurent, his eyes filled with something that might have been gratitude or guilt or both. He did not say goodbye, neither did the boys. The soldiers gave Emile and Laurent food, real food, canned beef and hard biscuits and chocolate that tasted like heaven. They wrapped them in wool blankets and put them in a truck, bound for a field hospital near Liège, where displaced civilians and orphans were being gathered. One of the soldiers, a sergeant from Ohio, asked Emile why he had saved a German pilot. Emile did not answer for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "Because Mama would have wanted me to." The story disappeared almost as soon as it happened. Friedrich survived the war and returned to Bavaria, where he became a school teacher and never spoke of his time as a pilot. Emile and Laurent were sent to an orphanage in Brussels, then adopted by a distant aunt in Antwerp. They grew up, married, had children of their own. They did not speak of the winter in the forest, of the pilot they saved, of the impossible choice Emile made beneath the pines. It was a memory too heavy to carry, too strange to explain, and so it was buried, like so many other stories from the war, lost in the silence of trauma, in the rush to rebuild, in the desperate desire to forget. No historian recorded it. No medal was given. No archive held its name. It was simply one more act of improbable, inexplicable kindness in a world gone mad. But stories have a way of surviving. In 1987, 42 years after the crash, a retired American veteran named Robert Callahan was sorting through old military records in preparation for a reunion. Among the documents was a brief report filed by a sergeant in February 1945, describing the recovery of a downed Luftwaffe pilot and 2 Belgian orphans found sheltering him in the Ardennes. The report was dry, factual, less than a page, but something about it stayed with Callahan. He began to search. He contacted archives in Brussels, in Munich, in Washington. He found Friedrich's name in Luftwaffe records. He found Laurent still alive living in Liège, and through Laurent he found Emile. When Callahan called to ask if the story was true, Emile, 73 years old, retired, widowed, was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Yes, it is true." Callahan asked why he had never told anyone. Emile's answer was simple. Who would have believed me? In 1990, Callahan published a short article about the boys and the pilot in a veterans newsletter. It was picked up by a Belgian historian, then by a journalist, then by a documentary filmmaker. Friedrich, still alive in Munich, agreed to meet Emile and Laurent for the first time since the war. The reunion was quiet, awkward, heavy with decades of silence. The 3 men, boys no longer, sat together in a small cafe in Brussels and drank coffee and did not speak of the war. But at the end of the meeting, Friedrich took Emile's hand and said, "You saved my life." And Emile, for the first time in 45 years, allowed himself to cry. The story of Emile, Laurent, and Friedrich is not a story about heroes. It is a story about children forced to make impossible choices in a world designed to destroy them. It is a story about hunger and fear and the small, inexplicable acts of compassion that refuse to be extinguished even in the darkest winters. It is a reminder that war does not only produce soldiers and victims, it produces moments, brief and fragile, where humanity survives in spite of itself. Emile did not save Friedrich because he believed in forgiveness or redemption or any grand moral truth. He saved him because, in that moment, it was the only thing he could do that made sense. And perhaps that is the most profound kind of courage, not the courage to fight, but the courage to choose kindness when every rational instinct screams to run. Today, the clearing where the plane crashed is overgrown, hidden beneath decades of new growth. There is no marker, no memorial, no plaque, but the story lives. It lives in the grandchildren of Emile and Laurent, who tell it to their own children. It lives in the archives where Callahan's article is preserved. It lives in the quiet, unrecorded memory of every person who has ever made a choice they could not explain, in a moment they could not undo, and carried it with them for the rest of their lives. The war took everything from Emile and Laurent, their parents, their home, their childhood, but it could not take the choice they made beneath the pines. And in a world that tried so hard to erase their humanity, that choice became the one thing no one could destroy.